Hi, Founder fans. Jason here with Michael Troy of the American Revolution podcast, and we are going to talk about a whole bunch of major generals. Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Michael, today's goal is to run through all of the major generals of the Continental Army. Now, we have recently spoken about some British leaders, and you're going to come back a few handful of times, and we're going to talk about a bunch of these gentlemen in further detail in the future. Today, we're just going to kind of do a once over, look at the what seems to be 29 human beings who at one point were major generals for the Continental Army. So I guess the best place to start is say how we're just going to ignore George Washington.
Right. He's not a major general. He's considered general of the army. So
Right.
he's above all these guys.
Right. So not only is he the guy, but he's also the George Washington. So anyone watching a show about the major generals of the Continental Army probably know who George Washington was.
One would hope.
Yeah. We should note June 15th, 1775, George Washington is given his office. Uh, and then it's 2 days later that some major generals are chosen. So why don't you lead us off? Tell us who the ranking major general in the Continental Army was.
Right. Well, Congress picked four men to be the first major generals. The very first one and the most senior was Artemus Ward. And you'd think that would be a pretty prestigious position, but it was actually a demotion for him. He was the head of the New England Provisional Army that was currently sitting in the siege of Boston. So he was the military commander, and he was being put into second in command behind George Washington.
Right. And as you called it, the Provincial Army can be seen under a kind of wide variety of names if you look in different places, but essentially it was the cobbled together militias of New England. Um,
That's right.
yeah. Uh, right. And as you said, he was, for all intents and purposes, commander of this army. Although, and we're not going to get too off topic, I have heard certain people argue that Joseph Warren was actually the person in charge, but by the time Washington gets there, he passes away. Sadly, anywho.
Yeah, Joseph Warren held some importance because he also had a civilian position within the Massachusetts provisional government, but he was a major general in the provisional army and presumably beneath Artemus Ward. But you're right. Warren had a lot of um, charisma and popularity within the ranks. He was kind of a natural leader within the army. Artemus Ward, not so much. Artemus was a little older. Both men were from Massachusetts. But Artemus Ward was kind of the senior military commander on site. And of course, you're right, it was all kind of cobbled together. There was a lot of question about whether a Massachusetts officer could give orders to a Connecticut officer of a lower rank, that sort of thing. There was a lot of debate over that sort of thing. So everybody was just kind of trying to work together because they were right in front of several thousand enemy British soldiers in Boston, and they kind of had to work together. But there wasn't a well-defined command structure, especially between the states at the time.
And I'm sure we'll get into
And
some of those arguments along the way.
right, and that's what part of creating the Continental Army was designed to resolve. Now you have to remember the provincial army that was besieging Boston was really thrown together literally overnight. Paul Revere made his midnight ride, called out the army. They were going after the British who were attacking Lexington and Concord, and all these militia turned out on a minute's notice. And several showed up over the following days, but really all these men just kind of picked up their guns, walked out of their houses, and were now in the army. And the only structure they really had was the militia structure that they came from. So a company would have a captain and the regiment would have a colonel, but how it was really all going to work together, they didn't know. And that all happened in April 1775. The Continental Congress convened for the first time, the Second Continental Congress convened for the first time in early May of 1775. So this was only a few weeks after all of this had broken out, and the members of Congress were kind of coming back in and saying, all right, what do we do now? A lot of them didn't even want to admit they were at war. They said, all right, well, there's been some problems, there's been some violence in Massachusetts. How can we peacefully resolve this?
Yeah,
And some of their heads were still in that direction.
yeah.
Whereas others, especially from New England, were saying, no, no, we're in a full scale war now. We need to put together an army.
Hey, Adam's cousins, what are you guys doing up there?
Yeah.
Essentially. Um, so let's move along. We do have a lot of guys to get through. So that's Artemis Ward
Yeah.
up top, and he needs to be given a number two. And as we were saying, one of the important things the Continental Congress was trying to do was to spread the wealth, so to speak, when it came to leadership in this apparent army. So they come out. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say a very important thing, especially for the New England delegates, was to make sure that the mid Atlantic and southern colonies were invested in this army and that they were very involved. That's one reason George Washington was chosen to command it. They wanted somebody from the South to make sure that, especially Virginia, one of the largest colonies, would play an important role in the war to come. So yeah, they really engaged in a lot of affirmative action in trying to select the various generals. They wanted to make sure various states were represented. States that provided some of the most soldiers would be more entitled to have higher ranking officers in the army because they were providing those soldiers, that sort of thing. So yeah, the next one down the line was Charles Lee of Virginia. Um, and we say he's from Virginia. He'd really only moved to Virginia a couple years prior. He was a British officer. He had served in Europe for many years. He'd kind of bumped around all over the world. He'd even fought for a few other armies in Europe over the years. He was the professional soldier that they were really picking to uh, uh, provide assistance to these local yokels in America who really didn't have a lot of experience outside of militia. So yeah, Charles Lee was the number three man in the army to start off with.
Yeah, and it is a reoccurring theme in the generals of fresh Brits who just over the last few years had moved to North America after serving in the army. And it is important to note, as you said, Lee was, as far as the top three ranking officers we've discussed, arguably pretty easily the most experienced. Someone who everyone expected they could trust, and Washington could say, "Go do this," and he would hopefully get it done.
Right. Lee had been a colonel in the British Army. He had actually served as a brevet general in another army. I forget which one, somewhere in Central Europe. Um, during a war, during peacetime, it was very common for British officers to go serve in other armies to get more experience, and Uh, Lee had done some of that. He had served in the French and Indian War. He had served in the American theater. He had also served in the 7 Years' War in the European theater. He was a very experienced, highly acclaimed officer. So the Americans felt lucky to have him.
And with him, the Continental Army, Congress, I should say, adds to the Continental Army someone who's a little more surprising in many fashions, Philip Schuyler of New York.
Right. You have to remember that New York was probably one of the most reluctant states to enter into this rebellion. They were largely Dutch population. Um, it, an English colonist felt almost more comfortable rebelling against the King of England because it felt like a family feud. For people who were Dutch colonists, and they had lived in these colonies for years, they were born in New York. Their fathers and grandfathers and great grandfathers had been born in New York, but they were Dutch. They still spoke Dutch. The British had taken over New Netherlands and turned it into New York many decades earlier, and allowed the Dutch to continue to live there and own their property and all that sort of thing. And of course, getting into a rebellion that did not go well could very easily mean that the king could say, all right, all you Dutch people, you're out of here. We're taking away your property and you're expelled from the continent. So the Dutch were very reluctant to get involved in the war, at least some of them were, a little more so than the English colonists. So New York was, as I said, outside of New York City, very reluctant to get involved in the revolution. Philip Schuyler was a member of the Second Continental Congress. He was a politician. He had some military militia experience, but he was a very wealthy and established man. And securing him on the side of um, the Patriots and in favor of the Continental Army was a very wise political decision for them to make. And that's why Philip Schuyler got picked as the number three general, number three major general, the number four general overall in the Continental Army.
It also helps that, for all intents and purposes, Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen had just invaded New York on behalf of Massachusetts when they took over Fort Ticonderoga. So we should throw that in there because, again, making the influence of a New York general extremely important. And Schuyler is immediately appointed head of the Northern Department.
That's right. You make a good point. New York was very upset by the fact that New Englanders, who New York and New England just did not get along at this time, New Englanders had invaded New York and captured Fort Ticonderoga. You have to remember, New York still claimed the land that what is today Vermont, which is where the Green Mountain Boys were living, and the Green Mountain Boys were considered outlaws. They were hated villains within New York. Uh, these were not people that got along together. When the Green Mountain Boys captured Fort Ticonderoga, the immediate reaction of Congress, and this was basically spurred by the New York delegation, was, all right, let's get them out of there and give the fort back to Britain right away. So that was kind of their mindset.
Right. Excellent. So he goes north to take control of Philadelphia. I'm sorry, of upstate New York. Would
Yeah,
eventually lead to the invasion of Canada, which was on my mind, but we're not going there yet. The last person appointed as those four core major generals was Israel Putnam. Uh,
yeah. Israel Putnam was kind of a surprise choice. Not the fact that he was from Connecticut. They had to pick someone from Connecticut because Connecticut, I think, was only behind Massachusetts in the number of soldiers that they had provided to the army. They had really turned out for the siege of Boston. What was kind of surprising was that Israel Putnam was not the most senior officer from Connecticut. That was David Wooster, uh, who Putnam was a junior officer to. But Putnam had done a really amazing job at the siege of Boston. He had really shown his leadership skills. He had done some kind of crazy stuff to go after the British. He literally uh, had a bunch of men wade out into Boston Harbor and, like, on foot, attack a ship with their muskets at one point. That was the kind of guy he was. So yeah, he was a real rabble rouser, really popular with the men, and so yeah, he got chosen as the final of the original four major generals.
right, but he's one of those guys that the men themselves really looked up to. Wooster outranked him in the Connecticut militia, but in the 2 months that this makeshift army had come together, Putnam, for all intents and purposes, had become a leader in that army, which seems to be the impetus for him becoming a major general. As you said, there are a bunch of issues though, because first of all, Silas Deane and Roger Sherman of Connecticut get into a bit of a scuffle over the whole thing um, at the Second Continental Congress. And furthermore, you have someone, we'll talk about this person in a minute, but John Thomas of Massachusetts had previously outranked Putnam in the British. I don't want to say the British Army, but in the French and Indian War, and he also would be appointed a brigadier general, but was also another person not excited about Israel Putnam.
Yeah, you find a lot of people who found their juniors being promoted above them in what was kind of a, you know, half political, half happenstance mess of appointing all these new officers while we're creating a new army, and there were definitely winners and losers. I mentioned David Wooster, who was a major general in the Connecticut Army, um, and was appointed a brigadier general in the Continental Army, initially refused to even take the position. He was not going to take a demotion, and he was not going to serve underneath his junior Israel Putnam. And you found other generals that felt exactly the same way. John Thomas was one of those people who felt he was being demoted, this was unfair, and all this stuff. And for the most part, they were taken aside and said, look, these are the original appointments. We're obviously going to be promoting a lot of brigadiers very soon. Just hang in there, do your part, be patriotic, understand our situation, and things will move up for you.
Yeah, help us recruit more men. There'll be more leadership positions.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that is mid June 1775, and that's how things stand throughout the first until the following December. So about 8 months, 6 months um, throughout the summer and fall of 1775, um, and a good portion of the siege of Boston. And
Right. You got to remember, the war is pretty static at this point. There's not, there's the siege of Boston. There's not actually a lot of fighting at the siege. They're basically just staring at each other across the water because the British felt outnumbered and the Americans had no gunpowder. So they were basically just looking at each other. So yeah, there wasn't a lot of action. There wasn't a lot of battles and casualties and reason to kind of readjust things at that point. So yeah, it basically sat there for around 6 months.
yeah, and that is essentially when they decide to invade Canada. Sounds like fun. Um,
Right.
Unfortunately, for reasons I'm still unclear on, Philip Schuyler, who was supposed to lead the invasion of Canada, starts going to Canada and then turns around. Now, I don't know if you have any information on that. I've never been able to determine if it was just business that he had to return for, or if it was his gout convinced him to return. I'm really unclear.
He did claim illness for his reason for turning back, but Schuyler was never a field commander in that sense, never felt comfortable in that role. And he always tended to want to stay at headquarters and let his subordinates handle the effort in the field. And he really turned over the invasion of Canada to his fellow New Yorker.
Founder fans, we had a bit of technical difficulty there. Talking about Richard Montgomery. Suddenly, my computer decided it wanted to start over again. So here we are. We have just gotten to Richard Montgomery. We were talking about earlier, we had mentioned how there were several former British persons who had retired from the British Army, and moved to North America just in time for a Revolutionary War. And Richard Montgomery is one of these people. He's appointed as a brigadier general serving under Philip Schuyler in the Northern Department. They start leaving to go invade Canada, and Schuyler turns back. And that is why we are talking about Richard Montgomery, who Michael, in December of 1775, is appointed as the 5th major general in the Continental Army.
Right. At the time, Richard Montgomery was in Canada. He had marched into Canada in October, November, and was at that point poised on trying to take Quebec. This was that combined effort with Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold had made the march across the Maine wilderness to meet up with Robert Montgomery at Quebec. So that's kind of what was going on at the time. Their hope was to capture Quebec City and make Quebec the 14th colony to be in the resistance against Great Britain. Um, while Montgomery was in Quebec, Congress decided that he was doing such a wonderful job that he deserved promotion to Major General. Unfortunately, Richard Montgomery never received word of his promotion. He died about 3 weeks after Congress voted to make him a Major General. On December 31st, he was part of the attack on Quebec, and he was killed by a British cannonball.
Almost instantly. They run into the city, and he's gone.
Yeah, he led the charge. They blasted a cannon right into him, and he fell and was gone. That was the end of him.
And within seconds, Benedict Arnold, the other leader, is also wounded and dragged from the field.
Benedict Arnold was invading the city from the other side, so he was leading an entirely different attack. But yes, he was shot too. He was shot in the leg and obviously survived, but he was taken out of the battle as well at the same time. Benedict Arnold, at this time, was a colonel, by the way.
Okay. Yes, he's not up there yet. So this
No.
happens, and the invasion of Quebec falls apart relatively quickly, and they retreat to Montreal. Eventually, they make it to.
Yeah, they were actually they remained around Quebec City under siege for a few more months, but yeah, eventually the British relief fleet came and they had to really pull back. Um, but yeah, the bulk of the forces at that point were in Montreal because right they'd given up on actually being able to take the city unless they received massive reinforcements. Now, they did receive massive reinforcements in March, and they came up with General John Thomas, who was essentially appointed as Montgomery's replacement. Um, Montgomery, I think, let me check my notes here, was, yeah, he was number 3 on the major generals list. John Thomas and Horatio Gates were actually more senior brigadiers to him, so Thomas, who was already upset about being a brigadier, was also not particularly happy about being bypassed by a more junior ranking brigadier. But he did stick with it, and they finally gave him his promotion to major general, and he joined the um, Quebec campaign. Now, that turned out to be the worst thing that could have ever happened to him because he went up there and within a matter of days got smallpox, went blind, and then died.
Right. And we
So,
we had mentioned him a little bit earlier in the conversation for being upset at being passed over, and he finally gets what he wants. And I understand one of the reasons for this is as we were saying about old Putnam before. Uh, Thomas had a tendency to mix with his men. I understand when he did get to Montreal, there was a smallpox outbreak. It was bad. I understand he separated, actually, he quarantined, for lack of a better word, a gigantic portion of the army to try and stop the spread. But as you said, he got too friendly with his men and succumbed to the disease himself.
yeah, smallpox took out the majority, killed the majority of Continental soldiers in Quebec. It really decimated the army, and that was one of the main reasons why the Quebec campaign failed.
Right. So a few months later, we have a new person appointed as a major general in the Continental Army, a fairly famous member of the Continental Army, Horatio Gates, who himself was a former British Army officer who had just recently moved to North America.
Right, Horatio Gates was also a Virginian by this time, but you're right. He was a professional officer who had spent a lot of time wandering around the world in the regular army and getting a lot of great experience. So
You know,
he
he
would certainly.
you know,
I was going to he's actually the first major general, the most senior major general to make it to the end of the war, still in active duty.
that's a fun fact. He's also the major general who has a lot of questionable decisions along the way.
Yeah, he definitely had his adversaries and problems, and yeah, we'll get into that when we talked about him as an individual. But uh, yeah, Horatio Gates was an interesting character. Really thought that he knew more than pretty much anybody else in the Continental Army, and his opinion of himself only grew over time.
Well done, Mr. Gates. And that takes us to August 9th of 1776. So between Horatio Gates and August 9th, we have a Declaration of Independence. Things have changed and gotten real serious. And then there is kind of a rash of appointments on August 9th.
Yeah, there's 4 promotions to major general in August, and I think there's also a bunch of brigadier promotions that same month. This is the time period where the army is moving from New England into New York, and they're seeing this massive military buildup of the British off the coast of New York, getting ready for an invasion. And Congress decides that they're really going to expand the size of the Continental Army. And of course, when you expand the Continental Army, you expand the number of general officers you have to command them. And so that's what they're doing at this point.
Right. So they throw in, I guess I'll list out the names in their order of seniority. They were given their seniority at this point in a particular order. Um, so the gentlemen selected are William Heath of Massachusetts, Joseph Spencer of Connecticut, John Sullivan of New Hampshire, and Nathaniel Greene of Rhode Island. So
That's right.
we'll start off with Heath. Heath also a former officer of the uh, uh, I believe he was an officer in the French and Indian War.
Yeah, he was a militia officer in the French and Indian War. I find it interesting too that we're moving out of New England, and all four of these promotions are New England officers. But yeah, William Heath was from Massachusetts. He was involved on the day of the Battle of Concord. He was out fighting with the men. He did have experience. He was um, a politician and a senior militia officer with a fair amount of experience from the French and Indian War. And he literally lived on Dorchester Heights. So he was a big part of the siege of Boston. He
Yeah.
was one of the generals able to go home and sleep in his bed every night.
Oh, I did not put that to. That's very convenient.
Yeah.
uh, I'm sure he was a gracious host to the other gentlemen from time to time. I, Again, we're not going to go too far into the war, but Heath ends up spending a huge portion of it in the Highlands outside New York City, kind of overseeing the no man's land of the war around New York City.
Yeah, Heath had some not so great leadership experiences early in the war, and Washington kind of shunted him aside. He did a lot of administrative work for the army and that sort of thing, but he never became a great military commander.
Now, Joseph Spencer is a character probably should know more about since he's the number ninth ranking major general in the war, but my memory is failing me a little bit. What can you tell us about Joseph Spencer?
He didn't last very long. He was given his first real major military command was to take back Newport, Rhode Island, after the British set up a camp there, and he basically screwed up the entire campaign and washed out of the army fairly quickly. He was only a major general for what, about a year and a half, less than that. Um, so yeah, his career never really particularly took off.
Right. Now, his subordinate, I guess we should say, John Sullivan, the first New Hampshire person appointed a major general. Now, John Sullivan, we could probably talk about for hours and hours and hours. Um,
Yeah, interestingly, John Sullivan was given the same task that Joseph Spencer had been given, trying to unseat Newport. And Sullivan was equally unsuccessful, but he at least gave it a better college try and didn't wipe out his career as a result.
right. Well, Sullivan, for his part, he would be involved in. He was a Continental Congressman. He would lead a very famous campaign across upstate New York, the Sullivan Clinton campaign. He yada 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 becomes a governor of Massachusetts or New Hampshire. I apologize. A very important leader. But again, we're getting through 29 people here, so we'll continue on a little bit, unless there's anything you want to
Yeah,
hit.
I would just say you will kind of notice a trend that a lot of the military leaders were also political leaders. That's not something we see today. We don't see, top military officers serving in Congress and that sort of thing. That was a very common thing in British tradition and very much so in the colonies at this time as well.
Yeah, especially earlier in the war. Although that does change a bit, a little bit later in the war, especially when we have the Newburgh conspiracy, where they're kind of complaining for pretty much that reason. These military men are military men, and those guys in Philadelphia, well, they're lawyers and doctors and merchants, and they have jobs to go home to.
Yeah, the officers especially toward the end of the war, did really focus on just being officers. There wasn't as much mixing as there was at the beginning of the war, but there still was some. And you also see when the war ends, a lot of these top generals and colonels go and get elected to office. But I guess that still happens today too. You see, heroes coming home from World War II and getting elected as well. That's I guess part of the norm.
That's true, and I guess I'm a bit biased. Listening to your podcast, you've talked about a lot, especially New Hampshire men. But you see a lot of people in the late 1770s resigning from the Continental Army, and then they go on to be politician, focus heavily on the politicians. Sullivan, I believe, is among them.
Yes, absolutely. Sullivan resigns in late '79, and enters a career in politics, much like Philip Schuyler did, and several others.
Now, our next character, and first from Rhode Island, is Nathaniel Greene, who I'm going to say right off the bat is arguably the most underappreciated general in the American Revolutionary War. Uh,
Yeah, he gets a lot of credit for his work in the Southern campaign in the second half of the war. Really does some amazing stuff. He's fun trivia point here is the only person in the army to go from being a private to a general within a matter of days. He enlisted in the army as a private because they would not give him an officer's commission. And then almost immediately they said, yeah, that's crazy. We're making you a general.
yeah, and then he goes on to be. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but he couldn't get a position within his regiment as an officer. He had to enlist as a private. They didn't like him because he had a limp, and they thought him marching would look silly with a limp, so they didn't want to give him an officer's
Yeah,
commission.
and then he goes on to be both quartermaster general and simultaneously leading the Southern campaign. That obviously many people helped with that, but essentially leads to Yorktown.
Yeah, Washington forced him to become quartermaster during Valley Forge. There was the whole nobody wanted the job, who should have had it at least, and um, they were trying to undermine Washington by putting his enemies into positions. And Washington said, "Hey, Nathaniel, you really got to help me out here and become quartermaster." So he took it very begrudgingly and kind of on the at least implicit understanding that at some point he would get a real combat role again. And he did get that chance when Horatio Gates blew up in the South, and they had to send Nathaniel Greene down to bail him out.
Yeah. So yeah, just to reiterate, he's winning the American Revolution while feeding and clothing the entire army. Nathaniel Greene. Moving on, although again, I'm sure we'll come back to him. Like I said, we're gonna have lengthy discussions on a few of these guys, so we'll definitely come back to him. Number 12. Although I should say, February, mid February 1777, we have one, two, three, four, five, six. I can't even count them. One, two, three, four, five, six new major generals. It's been about 6 months since the last slew of new major generals. Here we go with a whole bunch more.
Right, and Benedict Arnold really doesn't belong at the top of that list right away because he was not made a major general until many months later, and he was given retroactive seniority above all these generals who were promoted on February 19th. Um,
That's a great
Congress
point.
was yeah, Congress was building up at this point for another major campaign in 1777, which ended up being the Saratoga and Philadelphia campaigns. So they were picking a whole bunch of officers. You'll notice most of these officers come from the Mid-Atlantic states, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, because that's really where we see the war growing, where a lot more soldiers are coming from, and so they're trying to give a lot more leadership positions. And Benedict Arnold, who was from Connecticut, he was a New Englander, kind of got boxed out of that. They didn't want to promote another Connecticut officer. They already had Israel Putnam and Joseph Spencer from Connecticut, and they didn't want to put out a third one. So Arnold almost resigned at this point. He ended up getting promoted to brigadier a few months later after some more impressive service. But he was junior to all these officers who had been junior to him before they all got promoted. So he went from being the most senior brigadier general to becoming the most junior major general, which meant that there was nobody he could order that he couldn't order before the promotion.
Right.
So he was still kind of ticked off at that, and he kept fighting and fighting and fighting until they retroactively gave him seniority above all these generals that are getting promoted in February. And so that's why his official date is February 17th, 2 days
Well,
more senior than these others.
people love to hate that I say American hero Benedict Arnold. His argument at this point was, but I've won the most battles and the men love me most, which were objectively true.
Yeah, Arnold's big problem was he never played the political game well. He didn't get along well with politicians in Philadelphia. He really never spent any time cultivating those relationships. And he also didn't get along well with a lot of his fellow officers. He tended to be rather abrupt and dismissive of people that he considered inferior officers that just weren't as good fighters as he was. So he never played the political game very well, and he really had to wait for his abilities as a theater commander to speak for themselves.
Right. And to George Washington's credit, when Arnold wanted to resign, it was Washington who would repeatedly say, "No, don't resign. I really need you." Because Washington at least
You
knew
know,
talent.
when Arnold was left off the list of February promotions, uh, he immediately wrote to Washington saying, "Well, it's clear Congress doesn't want me, so I should just resign." That's what's appropriate when you're passed over. It means that you're really not wanted. And it wasn't he didn't at least portray it as leaving in a tiff. It was, well, clearly I'm not the people's choice to lead this army, so I should go do something else.
Right.
And Washington's immediate response was, wait a second, there had to have been a mistake here. Why aren't you on this list? That's insane. That was his, and then he, of course, wrote to a bunch of people in Philadelphia. And it's like, no, no, we just didn't want another Connecticut officer. And so Washington wrote back Arnold again and said, no, wait, please. Yeah, I know there's a lot of politics going on here, but we really need you. Please stick with it. And, I'll see what I can do.
Yeah. And fortunately, American hero Benedict Arnold did stick around for a little bit longer until he wasn't a hero anymore. Um, but let's talk
Stick
about some.
around.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, he got to be the hero of Saratoga and all that great stuff. And
Well,
yeah, after that, not so much.
that's we were talking about Horatio Gates before, who claimed himself to be hero of Saratoga, which is one of the laundry list of complaints Benedict Arnold had.
Yeah, right. Gates got the credit for it, but people in the know knew that Arnold was the man.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of these other gentlemen who were apparently better because they weren't from Connecticut. We have first of all William Alexander from New Jersey, um,
Right.
Lord Sterling.
Everybody knew him as Lord Stirling. He
Yes,
was a Scotsman who came to America as a young man, had a very large estate in New Jersey, northern New Jersey. Um, he was he had a claim to a lordship which the Scott Parliament recognized, and the British Parliament did not. I'm never quite sure what the details of that were, but it was apparently a very big sticking point for him. He was very annoyed at the British Parliament for not recognizing his lordship. And when he came to America, he insisted that everybody call him Lord Stirling. Uh, and But yeah, he was a firm, committed patriot, and did a lot to recruit several regiments in New Jersey to join the Revolution.
my favorite thing is George Washington's letters to Sterling literally start, "My Lord."
Yeah,
It's incredible, and it's weird because they're still recognizing that hint of nobility even during the Revolution. They wouldn't get rid of nobility for another however many years till the Constitution shows up.
right. This is kind of a holdover from the old world and the transition into the new world where titles are not considered appropriate anymore. But Lord Stirling very much thought his title was appropriate and was very much using it at this time.
But as silly as it sounds, he was very much trusted by George Washington. I understand even several times Washington would leave the army to go to talk to Congress, and he would leave Sterling in charge.
Yeah, Sterling was left in charge of the army several times. He was also given several important independent commands. He was really the man who directed the forage war in northern New Jersey. which was really devastating to the British. So yeah, he did a lot of impressive stuff.
Yeah. So the same day, he is appointed with Thomas Mifflin. Uh,
Yeah,
Mifflin, a delegate to the First Continental Congress, a merchant of Philadelphia. Um, he, by this point, immediately is I think one of the inaugural aide de camps or aides de camp to General Washington, and then he was the first quartermaster general of the army.
yeah, I could be wrong about this, but I think Mifflin served in the British Regular Army before the war. Um, so yeah, he did have a bit of experience. Uh, Pennsylvania was an odd state. You notice we're 2 years into the war already, and we don't have any major generals from Pennsylvania until Thomas Mifflin. And part of that is that there are so damn many pacifists in Pennsylvania. They don't have a military tradition, and they weren't actually raising a whole lot of troops because most of the troops they did raise were coming from the western part of the state that were very lightly populated. So now that we're moving into what's going to become the Philadelphia campaign, uh, Continental Congress decides, yeah, we need to get some Pennsylvania generals and appoint them quick. And so, yeah, Thomas Mifflin was one, and Arthur St. Clair, who was appointed on the same day, is a second major general from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I did want to know. So we get two of them at once, which is also strange because Pennsylvania is one of the biggest colonies. Virginia probably the most wealthy, but Pennsylvania right there, and Philadelphia. I mean, for all intents and purposes, if you ask someone in 1776, 200 years in the future, what's going to be the most wealthy city in America, uh, they probably wouldn't have said New York. Maybe some of them, but a lot of people would have said Philly was. I understand the largest British city in the empire outside of England proper.
Yeah, I think it was second only to London. I'm not sure about that, but I think so.
I've heard that too, but
Um,
I'm not 100% positive.
it was certainly the largest city in the colonies
Yeah,
by a considerable amount. And it was a fairly sizable state, but as I said, it did not have a military tradition and it did not contribute what you might consider its fair share of soldiers to the continental effort, which is why they had kind of a not as big a role in the leading officers of the army.
it was a Quaker
And
city.
right. It was Quaker, it was pacifists. There were a lot of German pacifists living in Pennsylvania as well. So, yeah, they had a lot of trouble recruiting within the state.
My ancestors are Mennonites from that area, though one did sign a loyalty oath, so that's cool. Anyway,
Yeah, my ancestors were living in Bucks County, Pennsylvania at the time, and they were German speaking and apparently served in the militia, but I don't know that they did much beyond that.
so the other gentleman from Pennsylvania was, I believe we pronounced the last name differently, Arthur St. Clair.
It's pronounced Arthur Sinclair. I often say St. Clair, but he did pronounce it at the time as Sinclair.
Okay, so Sinclair. That's good to know because I've heard you pronounce it on your show like that. I've always defaulted to St. Clair, but I will make an effort to do it correctly. Arthur Sinclair, which is a more common name nowadays. Um,
Yeah, I say it all
sorry. Oh, I mispronounce so much here that I assume when I hear someone else say it different, they are right. That
the
ask the people who gave me a lot of trouble about George With. It's
time.
not George Wythe, as I have said in dozens of videos. It is With.
Oh, really? I've always pronounced it Wyeth too, so there you go.
Well, no one gave me trouble for pronouncing it With, but I've gotten a lot of feedback for pronouncing it Wythe.
I'm
Um,
sure you're right. I never heard anyone else pronounce it, so who knows?
I'm fortunate I have not gotten a lot of angry comments on my channel, but that is by far the angriest I've made people. But let's talk about Sinclair. Uh, I'm not. I don't know a lot about his background. I know a lot about what happens in his future, but I don't know a lot about who he was at the time.
He was another regular officer in the regular army for a lot of years. I think he not a very senior officer. I think he was a captain, maybe a major. I don't know. But yeah, he ended up settling in Pennsylvania um, after his military career, um, and ended up settling in the western part of the state on the frontier with the Indians. And so that was the part of the state that was considered the most pro-patriot and the place where they drew a disproportionate number of recruits, even though it was a very lightly populated area. So he got involved fairly early in the war, um, worked his way up to major general, and yeah, I mean, we all know his career kind of imploded after he lost Fort Ticonderoga, but um,
Well, he gets another shot in the west in the Northwest Indian War a few 10 years later, and that ends with St. Clair's defeat, which is the worst defeat against Native Americans in American history. So once again, not
right,
great.
Matt, Matt Anthony Wayne had to go and bail him out.
Yes,
Um,
thank you,
right,
man.
or not bail him out, but avenge him, I guess is the right word. Um, but yeah, Sinclair had a whole second career in the Northwest Territory as a political leader and military officer. And you're right, the military officer part did not go particularly well.
No, well, that's right, because he is what the first governor or an early governor of the Northwest Territory. So he does his best.
Yeah,
I always have a little bit of like sympathy for St. Clair. I like he's just working his way up through the army, doing his best. And then he gets to the top and it goes real bad, and then he works his way back up, and then it goes real bad.
yeah. And he actually didn't resign from the army after Ticonderoga. He was court-martialed and acquitted, but his reputation was shot after that, and he mostly just held administrative jobs till the end of the war.
Right. Well, and he was acquitted because he did nothing wrong, and I'm sure we'll do an episode on St. Clair because his whole career is fascinating, and we'll get into it there. But we're still in
Yeah,
February of 1707. We got two more guys to go. We have Adam Stephen,
yeah.
who I believe was a longtime associate of George Washington from years past.
Adam Stephen and Colonel Washington served together on the Virginia frontier in the 1750s. They knew each other very well. Um, I wouldn't say they were friends. They were very different types of people. Washington was always a striving to be a gentleman, even when he was on the frontier. Adam Stephen was one of these guys that would sit down and drink with his buddies and have a good old time and just be a rough frontiersman kind of guy. He knew his stuff. He was a good fighter, but Washington and he never really got along. And then it certainly didn't help when Adam Stephen ran against Washington for the House of Burgesses at one point. So I don't know a whole lot of the details about how Stephen got um, commissioned as a major general, but I don't think Washington ever really liked him and kind of seemed to want to push him out of the army and eventually did, got him court martialed for stuff that a lot of other people had done and gotten away with, but Stephen got kicked out of the army for court martial.
Yeah, I guess would you use the term rivals, perhaps?
Yeah, to some extent, I think they were rivals. But I think just Stephen's character, I think, just rubbed Washington the wrong way his whole life.
Well, Washington was
I think it
a fancy pants.
Well, Washington was a fancy pants, but he actually came from this crude Western frontier type life. His mother, Washington's mother, lived kind of on the frontier and was kind of an uneducated woman who got into this, second marriage with Washington's father and kind of was a social climber as a result into Virginia society. I think Washington always kind of felt psychologically like he was a pretender, that he was really a crude frontiersman pretending to be a gentleman. And I think Stephen kind of reminded him of that to some extent. Maybe I'm
Interesting.
getting way too much psychoanalyzing Washington
Yeah,
here, but
that's
that's
all
kind of
right.
my opinion.
No, that's all right. The History That Doesn't Suck podcast referenced George Washington, paraphrase, but basically as the when he was joining the elites, he was uh, the poor kid in the rich kid charter school. If that makes any sense. He's like
No,
up
that's a
there
good
with the
analogy.
elites, but like he's barely in there, and he's trying to. No, guys, I belong here.
Yeah, he always felt insecure because he didn't have a real formal education. He had never read the classics. He had never done all the other things that all these elitists had done, and that always kind of grated on Washington.
Right. All right. And so the last person on February 19th, 1777, is Benjamin Lincoln, another Massachusetts guy.
He is. And Lincoln, another fun fact, I guess, is that he was the last American to be promoted to Major General in the Continental Army without first being a brigadier. He came from the Massachusetts militia. He was a major general in the Massachusetts militia and um, was a politician in Massachusetts as well. And after a time, he started really heavily lobbying to get a promotion into the Continental Army and obviously succeeded on February 19th.
And
So
oh, good.
I was going to say, he never really impressed me as much of a general. He ended up getting the Southern Command for a time and did not do particularly well there. Ended up with, I think, the biggest American loss of the war at Charleston, with a lot of men, 5,000 men captured or something. So, yeah, he was not a particularly good military commander. He was a pretty good administrator, which is why he got as far as he did. And that's most of what he did, probably all of what he should have done during the war.
Well, gotta give him a shot.
Yeah, he really messed up South Carolina, which I guess is why Southerners really hate the name Lincoln. I can't think of any other
I
reason.
there could be no other reason. um, and you mentioned he was the last American to jump up without being a brigadier. That's because suddenly we got some dude saying "wee wee" coming from France to join the fight. And a handful of months later, at the end of July of 1777, everyone's favorite founding Frenchman shows up, the Marquis.
Paul Gilbert, as everyone
Paul
knows him, right?
Gilbert, blah, 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 Marquis de Lafayette.
The Marquis de Lafayette, who is 19 years old, by the way, at this time.
Yeah,
He's a kid. He was a captain in the French army, very inspired by what was happening in America. He was a Freemason and, saw the ideals of American equality as kind of being an extension of Freemasonry and got worked up in this whole thing. He came from a very, very wealthy family, and all of his older relatives had died by the time he was a teenager. So he had way more money than any kid should ever have.
right.
I think his estates gave him an annual income of what would inflation adjusted be over $1 million a year today.
Yeah, at
So,
19 years
he,
old.
right, at 19 years old. Um, so he wanted to come to America. His um, father-in-law, who I guess kind of ran things, tried to run his life for him, um, did not want him to come at all. He had just gotten married to, I think, a 16-year-old, um, uh, and the family was very insistent that he stay and start, making babies and having a family. And he wanted to rush off to America and be in this war. So he ended up buying his own ship, taking a few of his more senior officers with him, and coming over to America to become volunteers. And he wasn't the first Frenchman actually to receive a commission in the army. We have a few others who were brigadiers by this time, but the Continental Congress was not happy with the French volunteers that they had received up until this point, and many of the American officers were upset at the idea that these Frenchmen were just going to come in and be promoted over top of them, without even being able to speak the language. So he actually, Lafayette and his buddies received a lot of pushback, and they said Congress said thanks, but no thanks. We know our commissioners over in Paris said you could be major generals, but we really don't want you. Why don't you go home? And Lafayette had to. You notice Lafayette is the first of three Frenchmen who become major generals, and the reason he was the first was the little rich kid said, "You know what? I will serve for free. You won't have to pay me, Not only that, I will pay for all my aides who are officers as well. I will pay all their salaries. So all you have to do is, give me the title and let me in. And Congress, which is always looking for a bargain, said, "Yeah, sure, you can be a general. What the hell?"
Get in there, kid.
So yeah, he initially, even though he was made a major general, was effectively serving as an aide de camp to George Washington. He was serving alongside colonels like Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence, who were all about his age. Um, and he really had to fight to get an independent command and push his way into really doing what a major general should do. And conveniently, when Washington had Adam Stephen cashiered, Lafayette was standing in the corner saying, "Hey, I can take over Adam Stevens' division. Let me at it." So that was how Lafayette got a start.
Now, there are, as you said, two other Frenchmen who follow in very close proximity. Now, I believe Lafayette sailed over with DeKalb, but it takes
I think
DeKalb
he broke.
a while.
I think
So,
DeKalb and DeCaldre, I think both came over with him.
oh, they all came on.
Um,
Okay, I didn't know if they were all on the same ship.
yeah. Um, De Caldre was an artillery officer and was going to be made commander of artillery, which Henry Knox, for some reason, was not happy about at all.
Can't imagine.
And he actually threatened to resign, as did Nathaniel Greene at this time. They said, "No, you're not bringing all these Frenchies in to be in charge of the Continental Army. We've got several years of experience now. What are you doing to us?" So they kind of made De Caldre an inspector general position. So he wasn't actually in command, but he was there to kind of give his sage advice and that sort of thing. They weren't quite sure exactly what to do with him. Um, they were trying to find a place for him, and conveniently, he died. He was on his way to the Battle of Brandywine. He was trying to cross the Schuylkill River. His horse fell off the ferry. He was on top of his horse, and both horse and rider drowned. So he was only in for, about a month
Yeah,
um, before he passed away. So that gave Henry Knox some relief, I guess.
right. Which
Uh,
means he was given command and then died before DeKalb even received his command.
yeah, DeKalb was um, I believe he was a general in the French army. He was far Lafayette's superior, and he was Lafayette's superior officer um, when they came over. But de Kalb wanted to be paid, and Congress didn't want to pay him, so that was why he was kind of sitting on the sidelines still. And they had actually told him, "No, why don't you just go home?" And he had been trying to make plans to go home at this time, although he was doing some kind of work on the side and inspecting some sites and things like that. Um, and they eventually decided that yes, they could find a place for him. And so yeah, September 15th is about 3 days after the Battle of Brandywine. Is when they finally decided to give DeKalb. And Lafayette had been badly injured at the Battle of Brandywine and was out of commission. So that was the time they brought in DeKalb. And he had a bunch of conditions, I think, for taking the job at that point. One of which was that he was supposed to be more senior to Lafayette, but you're right, from the dates here, it doesn't seem like he got that. Um,
He was
and
real picky about what was going on.
yeah, he also requested that his wife receive a huge pension if he's killed in battle, which I guess is reasonable.
Makes
But
sense.
yeah, he had a whole bunch of requests, and you might guess from his name De Kalb, it's not exactly a French name. He was actually of Prussian origin, but had served his whole life in the French army.
Well, I was gonna say actually, he had been sent to the or future United States by France before the revolution breaks out to gauge, okay, what exactly is going on over there? And since he pretended to be a wealthy German traveler because he was a wealthy German traveler, and he reported back to France, hey, this is what's going on over there. And additionally, to his benefit, I mean, I believe he was fighting with France in the 7 Years' War. So when it comes to fighting against the British, he literally had the most experience.
Yeah. Oh, he was a very good and experienced general, and actually, there's a lot of good evidence that says that Part of the reason for him coming over here was to see that if he could steer these British colonies into rebellion, into being taken under French control, and that he would be made the commander in chief of the army in North America, and take complete charge of everything. That was an original goal of his. Of course, that obviously didn't work out. But,
Would have been nice. I mean, for him.
I mean, yeah, and he served very well in the army. He was very highly respected, and he was actually killed in battle later in the war. So, he gave all for this country, his adopted country, I guess.
Yeah. Two out of the first three Frenchmen died pretty quick. Um,
Yep.
Now, after that, we're hitting number 21 here, and this is fascinating to me. Robert Howe is the first major general who was from south of Virginia.
That's right. There were very few top officers from the South. And he was not actually even the most senior brigadier general from there. I believe James Moore, was his senior, also from North Carolina. And James Moore was slated to become a major general, but he died very suddenly from an illness.
Right.
So Robert Howe got pushed up the ladder ahead of him.
But Howe had already been important to the Southern campaign at large. I believe he was there when Newport burned. I believe he was involved with that early in the war, like very early in the war. And then wasn't he also part of the attempted invasion of Florida?
Yes, on both counts. He did go up to Virginia at the very beginning of the war, and was part of pushing out um, Virginia's loyalist governor. Um, and then he became a senior commander of the Southern Command, and eventually became the commander of the Southern Command. Um, there wasn't a whole lot to the Southern Command at this time. Uh, Charles Lee had been sent down for a brief time at the beginning of the war, but then he was called back north. James Moore was in charge for a while, but as I said, he passed away from an illness. So, um, yeah, Howe became the commander of the Southern Army, such as it was, and he was mostly fighting in relatively small skirmishes with the British that were fighting out of East Florida. He was fighting out of Georgia, and there was a lot going on there. Howe was just very frustrated because the Southern governors never really wanted to provide any troops to the Continental Army, and they also thought they were allowed to just boss the Continental Army around anytime they wanted,
Well, that's the
and that
joke I like to make.
you
Is
had to
it
take
seems
orders
like,
from them.
yeah, it seems like Robert Howe did more fighting with the governors and leaders of the states in the South than he actually did fighting against the British.
Yeah, I believe he actually fought a duel with the lieutenant governor of South Carolina. Um, I think it was Gadsden. Um,
Oh,
Gadsden. Gadsden was from South Carolina. He was actually a brigadier in the Continental Army, but he got it into his head that because he was from South Carolina, he should be able to command all the Continental troops in South Carolina, even though he was a brigadier and Robert Howe was a major general. And Robert Howe kept saying, "No, I'm outrank you. I get to say what the soldiers do."
right.
And Gaston had this big political fight about it, and he went to the state legislature and also the Continental Congress and say, "Hey, why aren't I in charge of all these people?" And everybody kind of had to sit him down and say, "Because you're a brigadier and he's a major general, and that's the way the army works. Doesn't matter what state you're from." So it got to be a big thing. They had a lot of fighting with each other. They had a duel. I think that was after Gadsden resigned from the army and got elected lieutenant governor. So yeah, there was a lot of hostility, I guess, between Howe as the commander of the Continental Army and the political leadership in the South.
That's fascinating. I had no idea Gadsden fought a duel. Gadsden, of course, is the famous Gadsden flag, is the yellow one with the "Don't tread on me" snake. But he had also been to the
Yeah,
Stamp Act Congress, 15 years before this. I believe he was at the first Continental Congress. Gadsden, I've heard him referred to as the Paul Revere of the South. So, you know, before we, I know he sounds like the bad guy in this particular story, but I want to give him
He,
that
no,
credit.
he was a good patriot and a very effective politician. He just, like a lot of Southerners at the time, was not happy about having people placed above him.
So we should move along a little bit. At the same time that North Carolina got its first major general, New York only got its second. This is again in we are in October 20th of 1777, and Alexander McDougall shows up. Uh, what do we know
Yeah,
about
well,
McDougall?
he's actually the third after Schuyler and Montgomery.
Oh,
But
I forgot about Montgomery. It was so quick.
yeah, well, yeah, he was just short. Um, yeah, Alexander McDougall played a very big role in the. I'm not sure if they actually called it the Sons of Liberty, but the group of patriots that were causing trouble for the British before the war. He was very involved in New York City and all the action that was going on there. Um, and of course, immediately went into the army when it got started. He did not really do a whole lot outside of New York. I know he had a number of positions in the Hudson Valley, a lot of commands up there. I
He was
can't say I
working with
know.
William Heath a lot. I'm under the impression
Yeah, I think that's right.
in
He
that
also did some
region.
work with Israel Putnam. Um, but yeah,
You're
he
right though.
he actually
McDougal's big impact on the revolution is, I believe they did call themselves the Sons of Liberty. We often think of Boston being, all this violence in the streets, this mob violence. New York's many other cities, but New York also was very violent at the time. And there, McDougal had participated in the Battle of Golden Hill, it's usually
yeah.
called, which was more of like a hostage situation and a standoff than it was a battle. But it was a violence between the British officers and colonists in, I want to say, 1774. I don't remember the
Uh,
exact date.
no, it was yeah, it was a running street riot, and it happened, I believe, right before the Boston Massacre in 1770. I could be
Oh,
wrong about
oh, you know what? You are right. I was thinking it was just before Lexington conquered. I believe you are right. It is by then. I'll pull it up. Oh,
that. Yeah, I think it was right before the Boston Massacre, and it doesn't get as much press because nobody actually got killed in it. There were several people that
right,
were bayoneted, very seriously wounded, but no one died.
right. Pulling it up. I need to know the date, but we'll continue on while that comes up. Oh, Battle of Golden Hill came up right away. January 19th, 1770. You were right. It was mere, I'll say, weeks. Wait, yes, weeks.
Yeah,
March. Okay, I
March
found it.
17th,
I found
Boston.
it. Yeah, so a few weeks before. So, but that's a good point to bring up. Is it wasn't just Massachusetts was upset at what was happening. Their violence was breaking out all over the place because of this.
Imagine that street violence in New York City.
Imagine. Glad I live in the woods. Anyway, after about a month later, after McDougal, we get another Frenchman who was really an Irishman, who was from the French army, who is considered one of the great villains of the American Revolution.
Yeah, he gets a bad, well, maybe a somewhat justified rap, but
Yeah, he gets a bad rap.
it does get a Thomas Conway was born in Ireland, as you might guess from his name, it doesn't sound particularly French. But he was a Catholic, and his family ended up fleeing to France when he was fairly young, and he joined the French army and made a career there, moving fairly well up. He actually came to America before Lafayette, willing to volunteer with the Continental Army as a French officer, and I believe he was given a brigadier's position before Lafayette took his position as major general. Um, One of the reasons Conway they took in Conway at a time when they weren't too happy about having French officers was that Conway actually spoke English and spoke it quite well, so that was a considered a big plus. So yeah, Conway came in. Washington was a big fan of his for being made a brigadier general. Um, he then did some relatively unimpressive stuff at the Battle of Brandywine and the Philadelphia campaign, and he decided that he should be made a major general. And even though there were quite a few brigadiers that were more senior to him and that Washington thought were more deserving of being made major generals before him, but Conway was very full of himself, went to Congress and insisted that this happen. And this was the whole time in which right after um, Saratoga and the Philadelphia campaign, when Washington's political um, power was kind of in a low, and others were looking to bypass him. And of course, we have what's later called the Conway cabal as a result of all this. People who were hostile to Washington and knew Washington did not want to see Conway promoted him anyway, and ended up making him Inspector General of the Army, so that basically his job was to um, look over everything Washington did and criticize it. And that worked very well for Conway because Conway's ticked at Washington at this point for opposing his promotion, and the two did not get along well at all. And
Right, and we won't get too into it, but a series of events unfolds, and he is the namesake of the attempt to have Washington replaced with Horatio Gates.
right, a big part of it was really Horatio Gates. Conway ends up being the fall guy for everything, and with some deserving it somewhat. But right, you find out the hard way that when you get into a fight with George Washington, you lose, and that's what happened to Conway.
Right, and everyone kind of slinks backwards, except Conway. Well, Conway gets shot in the face because John Cadwalader challenges him to a duel, and literally shoots him in the mouth, which he claims will stop the damn rascals lying, and it did.
Yeah, yeah. Conway could not stop bad mouthing Washington after he kind of lost the political fight with him, and right, Cadwalader was not too happy. Many of the officers were not happy about that. Cadwalader did something about it.
Yeah,
And shortly after that, he resigned and went back to France.
he's only major general for a few months, and then he goes back to France. What's interesting, I remember when I was researching Conway, uh, it's hard to determine where he like ends up. He kind of vanishes. Like it's hard to find out where he dies, and I assume he dies because it's been a few hundred years. But
Yeah, ironically, he dies, I think, living in Ireland under British protection.
that's what I had
He
read. Yeah,
ran into some problems, I'm guessing, from the French Revolution and had to leave France and ended up going back to his old enemy, Britain, to where he found a home and died peacefully.
great. Well, good for him. So moving along, number 24, we get a general from since there was no Germany, Prussia. I guess technically DeKalb was already here, um, but Frederick Baron von Steuben finally gets his promotion.
Right, von Steuben came here,
Steuben, okay, got it.
and again, that's my pronunciation. Who knows? Um, right, he had no association with the French army. He was a foreign officer who came over here, and one of the very few who came not from France. I think von Woodke was one of the few others who made general at least. But yes, von Steuben came over, uh, had a note from Benjamin Franklin saying that he had been, I forget, a major general or lieutenant general or something in the Prussian army and one of uh, Frederick the Great's top aides or something, and none of it was true. He had served in the Prussian army, but I think he was like a captain or something. He never really had a very serious role, and after when peace broke out, he actually lost his commission in the army, he had to be retired, and um, worked as a manservant for a local baron or something in Prussia for a lot of years. So not a very impressive background, but he said he had an impressive background, and he came over and managed to impress a lot of people here. And of course, is all credited with developing the first drill manual for the Continental Army and turning the Continentals at Valley Forge into a much more professional European style fighting force. And yeah, I mean, spent his entire was here for the rest of the war.
his credentials might have been all hype, but he certainly lived up to the hype.
He's the poster child for fake it till you make it.
That is a great way to put it because he comes in, he can't even, like, he speaks French, which is his second language to aides, which I think at least at a certain point was Lafayette, and several people helped. He would speak French, and they would translate the French into English. Except I'm under the impression I don't remember the words he knew. He only knew like a few English words, and it was something like "God damn it" or something of that nature.
Well, the first English words he picked up were all swear words. Yeah,
Yeah,
he asked. But yeah, many of Washington's aides de camp spoke French. I mean, not only Lafayette, but John Lawrence spoke fluent French. Alexander Hamilton spoke fluent French. So he made a lot of friends among the junior officers, and he was actually a very friendly guy. He was one of the very few top officers who will go out and speak with the enlisted men and try to figure out what their problems were, and how he as a general could make things better for their situation and that sort of thing. So he gained a lot of popularity really fast. Um, he
one
also liked to have sans culottes parties at his house, which sans culottes meant without pants.
yes, I understand. Yeah, and we will probably do an episode on him too. But I understand he is perceived to be really one of the only homosexual fathers of the United States. It's arguably
Right.
why he was kicked out of Prussia and then kicked out of France.
That is a possibility. Yeah, homosexuality was a crime
Right.
in both America and Europe at the time. It was a felony that could get you hanged. So people were not open about being homosexuals because that would get you killed.
Right.
So it does seem pretty clear from the evidence that he was homosexual, that he had um, a couple of lovers among his aides, male, that he ended up living with after the war. He ended up adopting two of them because that was the only way he could have a familial relationship with these men and leave his property to them
Right.
because gay marriage was not a thing in the 1770s. So right, he almost certainly was a homosexual, and most people kind of knew it and just kind of gave it a wink and a nod and ignored it because he was such a great guy and was a very valuable officer.
He was a
So
lot of fun.
nobody was pushing the issue.
Yeah, and the other thing I always like to point out about von Steuben is like, so not only did he build this army, build the Continental Army, he turned them into like some guys to soldiers. But when he takes over, he makes sure he rearranges the camp at Valley Forge like almost entirely, where he moves the latrines to the opposite side of camp as the kitchens, which is great. But like
Yeah, he
like
put
it's
in place
simple things like
a whole lot of different policies to clean up the camp, prevent the spread of disease, that sort of thing. These were all things that professional soldiers in Europe knew how to do. And even if he was only a captain in Europe, he knew these things because he was an officer in a European army, and he brought a lot of that wisdom and experience to the Continental Army.
yeah, it's really interesting that the British soldiers, like the Charles Lees and Horatio Gateses, who had so much experience in the British Army, didn't uh, come up with similar outlines, but here we are. So as I said, we could talk about von Steuben all day. He's was May of 1778, and then it is another 2.5 years before we get another major general. And
Right, we're really getting close to the end of the war here, and these are people who had spent their careers in it's either colonels or brigadiers for most of the war, and we're kind of giving them, kind of an end of the war bump at this point.
right. Um, it is still before Yorktown, I should say, for William Smallwood, and then a month later, Samuel Holden Parsons. Um, is there anything you'd like to add about Smallwood? I guess is the first one from Maryland. There's that. Anything about the careers of those two gentlemen we should throw out here?
I mean, both of them did have very creditable, honorable careers during the war. They were both good combat commanders. I believe Smallwood and Washington had a big tiff at one point in around the time of Valley Forge. I can't remember the details of it. Um, but yeah, I think Smallwood brought up a bunch of volunteers who were supposed to fight, and they were going to fight with Anthony Wayne, and that was when Anthony Wayne got hit with the Paoli massacre, and Smallwood did not come to their aid, and ended up like half of his force ended up deserting and running back to Maryland because they were afraid of the British soldiers after that. So it was a very embarrassing time for Smallwood, but he did manage to rebuild and come back and do a lot of good work after that.
Yeah. As for Samuel Holden Parsons, I'll be honest, I often confuse parts of his career with Samuel Blakely Webb, also of Connecticut, and I don't know why. They were very different people. But I understand Parsons led a bunch of raids on Long Island. Is
Yeah,
what he's best known for.
his name comes up on a lot of the fighting that goes on between British held Long Island and New York and Patriot held Connecticut. I constantly see him being called into various activities along there. I don't know a whole lot of detail about some of the stuff he'd done, but that seemed to be a big part of his military career.
A bunch of the stuff that happens in the TV show Turn, that they give credit to the spy ring, was actually Samuel Holden Parsons. I grew up in that area,
Okay.
so that's what I know about Parsons, though he was from Connecticut. And I do know actually Parsons. This is a little off topic, but in the future, he ends up being one of the founders of Marietta, Ohio, when Connecticut starts settling Ohio, trying to claim Ohio as part of Connecticut. And then he is out in the snow on a campaign. He like they find him, he drowns and then is frozen. They don't know if he froze to death or drowned first. Out in western Pennsylvania. This is a years after the war in the future, but that's
Yeah.
sadly for Parsons. That's what I remember most about him. Um, and then,
Hmm. I remember Anthony Wayne had that same fate, but yeah, could have
yeah,
happened to Parson.
it's a little. It happened. Hey, it's the wilderness, man. That's what you were fighting for. You wanted that Ohio Valley, didn't you?
Yeah, careful what you wish for.
Right. Um, so that's it until Yorktown. And then in the weeks after Yorktown, there are two more people appointed Major General. Finally, after 8 years, at this point, 6.5 years, Henry Knox is finally awarded the position of Major General.
Yeah, Henry Knox was I think, the longest serving brigadier, and yeah, he was commander of artillery for almost the entire course of the war. Uh, did a lot of really valuable work, and I think this was kind of his reward at the end of the war to finally be promoted to major general.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great big thank you. This has been long overdue because he almost immediately, goes to the Continental Congress and becomes Minister of War, and then he
Yeah,
does
well,
the same thing for Washington's administration.
he was the one officer who did not resign at the end of 1783, and he ended up actually becoming the commander in chief of what was left of the army after Washington resigned, um, which admittedly was like about 100 soldiers at one point. There was not a big army at that point. But yeah, he did basically take over the command of the military, and was famously Washington's first Secretary of War of the Constitution.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. He does take over for George Washington.
Yeah.
Like, and it's right at just a few years after he's finally Major General. And the day after that, we get another Frenchman getting the promotion too. Again, kind of an honorable thing with Louis Duportail, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong.
Yeah, close as I know.
Okay. And Duportail had come over a few years earlier. Um,
Yeah, Dale, I think, started as a colonel when he came over to volunteer. He was an engineer by training and did a lot of great work setting up forts and artillery placements and things like that. And I think um, his work was especially effective at Yorktown, which is maybe one reason why he got this final promotion.
right. And kind of as you said, he doesn't lead a lot of men, but his work fortifying up and down the coast, I understand, is just one of those gigantic tasks that's super underrated. Um,
Right, and it's a skill that most of the Continental Army did not have. The engineering experience and artillery placement and stuff like that was just not something that most Americans had gotten being in a militia army before the war.
right.
So Dupertail brought a lot of that experience to America.
And then we come to our last and final person, number 29, William Moultrie, in October of 1782, a year after Yorktown.
Yeah, by this time we're already pretty much negotiating the Treaty of Paris. I always kind of wonder if they Continental Army looked around and go, you know what? We never had a general from South Carolina. Maybe we should pick one.
Yeah, or Georgia, but
Yeah, well, Georgia and Delaware never got a general. So, um, but yeah, William Moultrie obviously had a fairly storied career throughout the war. Um, did a lot of great stuff, and uh, yeah, I forget when did he become brigadier. I think it was fairly late in the war as well. He was a colonel for a long time.
uh,
Um,
76. No, pretty early.
okay, that's not too bad.
Yeah,
Uh, I remember he was Colonel Moultrie when he was fighting um, at Fort Charleston. So I
right.
over when Clinton was trying to take it. But yeah, I guess that was pretty early on.
And that's his
Um,
big claim to fame. He serves obviously through the entirety of the war, becoming the last major general in the Continental Army. But his big claim to fame is that particular battle where uh, he gives South Carolina its nickname, the Palmetto State, and he gives it its flag, for lack of a better purpose.
right,
Which,
and Fort Sullivan in South Carolina becomes Fort Moultrie.
right, he's certainly a favorite son of that particular uh, state. Was it a colony at that? Was it still a colony? No, it must have been a state at that point.
It was the summer of '76. It was right about that time. I don't know.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, I guess it was. I think it was right before the independence declaration. So yeah, it was probably still a colony at that point. Um, but yeah, William Moultrie serves throughout the war. A lot of stuff in the Southern Theater. Has a fairly storied career, and right, he's the last major general before the war ends.
Yeah. And there it is. Although we had a little bit of a hiccup there, we were able to cover all 29 people in an hour and a half. That's basically 3 minutes a person, if my numbers are right. Uh,
Yeah,
which
I
is,
don't know. I'm lucky to get through one person in an hour and a half usually.
I know, that's crazy. That's why it was so nice working together. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining me and helping me work through these generals. I knew I'd blank on some of them, and together we were able to at least comment something on all of them. That's a
Yep.
success. Yeah, so we are going to have you back. We haven't figured out if we're going to go through all 29 guys or not, but you'll be back. We'll talk about some of these gentlemen at a little more length in the future. Michael, from again the American Revolution podcast, love what you're doing over there. Thank you so much for putting that out. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
Founder fans, make sure you hit like and subscribe, and we'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.